Greetings from Community Presbyterian Church. I'm Reverend Cooper, and I'm bringing you the third installment of our Proverbs Bible study. Today's lesson will focus on chapters 7 through 9 and will hopefully be just a little bit shorter than our former studies have been because we're not introducing as many new concepts. As we were looking at the introductory chapters of the book, we needed to lay some groundwork and framework for the text itself. Having already done that, we can dive right into chapter 7. So let's get started. Previously, we've been sectioning off each of the chapters into distinct units so that we could digest them piece by piece. But chapter 7 really functions as one entire unit. And that's a unit that I would call the adulteress tempting the young man. And this is primarily the father's tale to his son of another son, a wayward son who's gotten lost on the path of folly, the consequences of which were death, as cited in verses 23 and 27. In my reading of the text, there's a very distinct shift going on overall in the tone, and that shift lends itself to several layers of analysis that I'd like to get into now. First and foremost, what this shift indicates is that there's more of a fatherly concern for the son. There's overall simply a more paternal sense about this chapter as opposed to the other chapters, and I think that will come out as we continue analyzing this specific chapter. The next shift is in literary technique. There's no longer just narration of the world that exists taking place, where in chapters 1 through 6, the father is really teaching. And while he's teaching, he's using these descriptions of the two women, woman wisdom and the woman of folly, to describe the fabric of the Israelite worldview. And in so doing, he's telling a more distant tale to the son of the world that is, teaching more generally, more generically, and it's a bit more foreboding because he's saying that these are things that could be. And so that tense of could puts it off more in the future. Part of what happens is that off in the future, that distance between the son and these possibilities is brought home in chapter 7, where the father then grounds these general maxims or wisdoms about Israelite culture in the experience of another son. And so, he's localizing it. He's setting it within an example. He's no longer teaching at large. He's telling a story. And so, there's a literary shift from narration and teaching to narration of storytelling. And then on top of that, there's a sense of urgency that ends up being picked up in this chapter more so than in the previous chapters. And I think the best example of that is in chapter 7, where it's referenced that this wayward son ends up in Sheol. Following the way of the adulteress leads the way to death. Formerly, when the father's teaching about the woman of folly or the way of the unrighteous, there is the threat of damnation looming off somewhere in the future. For example, in chapter 1, verse 12, there is an allusion to this wayward path leading to Sheol, which is the house of the dead or the place of the dead in ancient Israel. But the threat becomes more imminent since it's given in an example of another son's bad experience who ends up dying because of his poor decision making. So that adds urgency. But because there's also now this new layer of concern for the father protecting the son, therein lies the shift to the paternalism. It's no longer just the father saying, hey kid, watch out. There's one good way to go, one bad way to go. It really becomes a father seeking to protect his son from poor decisions that could lead him into not just poor choices and bad consequences, but ultimately to damnation. And so that paternal tone is not exactly coming out in the kindest ways, but it's definitely present. So those are numerous shifts that are taking place in chapter 7. And part of my reading here is that there's a balance then struck as a result of this shift. The authorial intent may be different than we were getting at last week. So for example, we were really pushing back on the ways in which the authors of the book of Proverbs were excluding women from the teachings and possibly even teaching some anti-feminist sentiments that we clearly as postmodern readers can identify in the ancient text. But I do think that when you introduce this idea of paternalism, which is much more present in this chapter in particular, the limits of those patriarchal voices start to crop up. And it becomes clearer that there is a balance in the voice of the author and the narrator, that it's both a patriarchal text, but it's also very paternal. And so it's not just some crazy Hebrew dad railing against women. It's a caring father trying to teach his son kindly how to avoid damnation. One other shift that takes place in chapter 7 that goes along with all of the other shifts is that there's less of a focus on the two women. You do have a laser focus on the one woman being the adulteress, but you also have the father speaking more directly to the son by virtue of the fact that he's shifting to an example. He's not teaching at large about just the culture, wherein the subject of his teaching, the content of the lesson, is there's this one woman and then there's this other woman. The teaching is just directed to the son, be safe, protect yourself. So although there are implications in the author's writing that confine women to certain roles, having two choices in life between either virtue and shame, as we discussed last week, this isn't necessarily intended to cast a negative light on women. It reflects the author's worldview. That was just the reality in ancient Israelite culture, that women had the choice to uphold or walk away from virtue. And something that we haven't yet articulated that is really important to this text is that the female responsibility to maintain virtue was balanced by the male's responsibility to exercise their power with wisdom. So what isn't being said, much like direct sayings to women aren't being said, what isn't being said is that men held the power in ancient Israelite culture. And so they had the purse strings, they had decisions to make about bloodlines when they married, things of that nature, and all of their power extended into the public realm. As a result, it wasn't like they just got out of responsibility. Yes, it mattered less if they maintained virtue within the home, because that was much more dependent on the female. But it mattered incredibly that they maintain wisdom in their choices, because they extended into the public realm. And so much of what you're hearing in all of these chapters, but with the paternal voice in chapter 7, quite pointedly, you're hearing a father tell his son, choose wisely. What decisions you make have implications that go above and beyond your own virtue. They will extend into the public realm, and it matters that you make good decisions because it will affect more than just you. Moving into chapter 8 now, this is woman wisdom described in her fullest portrayal. This does break down neatly into 2 sections, verses 1 through 21, which I would call the marketplace lesson, and then verses 22 through 36, which I would call the co-creator question mark. And so section 1, verses 1 through 21, we see woman wisdom continuing her speech. In the very first chapter, verses 20 through 33, woman wisdom enters into the town square or the marketplace, whatever public arena you want to imagine there. And she is kind of like on her soapbox addressing the people of the town. And in chapter 1, she is saying, beware of refusing me. That's not going to do you well. So it's a little bit more foreboding of speech. And here she's shifting to almost a sales pitch. It's kind of strange. There's a bit of self-promotion in her language. And you see that over and over again. She talks about how kings love her, and then, you can draw the connection there between her being of regal prestige, if you like, but she's also very clearly saying that she's better than silver and gold, she's better than jewels, and that loving her brings wealth. So you can look at that self-promotionally if you want, but really the intention there is to just uplift her as being incredibly worthy, and more worthy than the material goods of this world. Something that kings like King Solomon in particular would understand as worthy of pursuit, above and beyond anything material in this world. That also has the function, her speech and her self-promotional speech, of helping to contrast woman wisdom with the adulteress, because her speech is taking place in the public arena and presumably in the daytime, which directly counters the speech that we get from the adulteress in the previous chapter, where she's sneaking around at night, kind of in a corner somewhere, trying to lure the young man into her home while her husband is away. And so you get this nighttime sneaky lady versus this daytime woman of virtue. Clearly one's upright, one's fallen. One personifies wisdom and the other folly. So again, here the contrast is not just between two Israelite women, it's the contrast of wisdom personified and folly personified. Then in the second portion of the chapter, verses 22 through 36, you get, frankly, my favorite part other than the last chapter of the book, where woman wisdom is described in some respects as a co-creator alongside God. She describes herself as having been present beside God before the creation of the world took place. And if you follow along carefully, her description of the creation story, it accords well with the creation story that we get in the book of Genesis. And then she says some interesting stuff. She says that she was his daily delight. And she's sort of describing herself as being a partner to God in some way, either his muse, his joy, maybe his support. That has a lot of space for interpretation. It's not very direct what she means there, but scholars have often interpreted that to mean that she's hinting at being God's partner. So we have some bold claims being made. Woman wisdom was present at the time of creation. That makes a claim about more than just the origins of her being and the timing of her creation. It says something about her status in the divine council, if you will. That's the topic for another discussion, but it's simply to say that there were arguably other divine creatures, and there may have been a female character. This could have been her, and it's putting her on par with God the Creator. And so scholars read this a few ways. That woman wisdom is a goddess, and that's very interesting. It's not explicitly stated in the text, but because these wisdom sayings are an amalgamation of cultural wisdom taken up from the ancient Near East, and they're influenced from other cultures outside of Israel, there is some argument that this is actually a goddess of another ancient Near Eastern religion that sort of gets hinted at here and overlooked otherwise in the Hebraic scriptures. Two, there's the suggestion that this would be a feminine counterpart to the Father of creation, and that says nothing about any divine council. That says quite literally that God would have a female counterpart. God the Father is the male deity of God, the Godhead of the Trinity as we know it, and that would have a female counterpart. These are mostly unheard of interpretations for numerous reasons, the primary of which being that monotheism forbids any dualistic elements to God. So this idea that God the Father could have some sort of mother element or some sort of wife or just any sort of female component would degrade the monotheistic understanding that God is a singular being and entity and simply the Father. So this isn't the kind of thing that you would have heard except in this contemporary context where we have the ability to really read text liberally and hear other interpretations that haven't been quieted intentionally because they would support a theology that shouldn't be supported. And so anyway, all of that sort of sums up the text into a distinctly pro-womanist set of verses. Woman wisdom is more than just an Israelite woman. She's imbued with divinity. And that's a bold claim in a patriarchal context, no matter how you explain it away, if it's coming from other ancient Near Eastern texts or if it just was a way of, writing the personification of wisdom into a more religious context than just a cultural one. Either way, it's profound for the text. And then, to take it a step further, some modern scholars will say that this woman wisdom is identical to the word that was with God in the beginning of John's gospel. So if you compare this to John 1, you'll see what I'm talking about, and that's understood to be the logos that was with God, or the rationality that was with God in the beginning of creation. And some would say that that logos, that rationality, is woman wisdom, and this is the Hebraic textual support that gives consistency to that gospel attestation. So we see it in the gospel, and then we see it supported back in the Hebrew scriptures of Proverbs. So there's some argument to be made there. I personally think that's a bit of a stretch, but I do think that what we can take away from it is an understanding that women were seen as worthy, having to do with their virtue, but there's more to it than that. They're also seen as worthy in the eyes of God in a really bold and beautiful way, and this is one way of describing that. So no matter how you characterize it, there's another element added to woman wisdom, and she becomes more than we might have thought she was after reading this chapter. Chapter 9 closes out this bookend, like we talked about in the very first Bible study, the first installment of the book of Proverbs, that this is the opening bookend to the wisdom sayings we'll get in chapter 10, and there's a closing bookend. So we're closing out the storytelling portion of the book and the narratival portion of the book. And this breaks down neatly into 3 units. The first being chapter 9, verses 1 through 6. That is wisdom's feast. And then 7 through 12, we get just a set of general maxims again. And then 13 through 18, we get the invitation from the woman of folly. And so both women are issuing invites to the townspeople. One sets the table of merit, clearly that's woman wisdom, and the other sets a table of dishonor, clearly that's the adulteress or the woman of folly. What is interesting here is that one house is clearly holy, while the other is the house of the dead. And so, we've been hinting at this and getting more explicit with it in chapter 7, but then here it really comes out that woman wisdom is possibly deified, but really regaled as holy. But the other woman is forbidden, and forbidden so much that she is really the gatekeeper to Sheol. And so you could really play with that a lot and extend your understanding of these 2 female characters if you wanted to, but I will leave it here. And then what I want to do to close up this part of the bookend is to pick up some of the former themes that we introduced in previous studies. First, I'll say that righteousness was something that we defined in our first lesson as a communal sense of well-being that carries with it a concern for others. It's not just righteousness as in personal piety. It is righteousness that includes piety for the sake of others and trying to create a communal sensibility that cares for the world around you. So I think it's really important to weave that back into some of what we were saying about chapter 7 and the limits of the anti-feminist sentiments in 4, 5, and 6. To say that men were being taught to be righteous while women were being taught to uphold virtue. So in those 2 distinct teachings, what you have is the men being taught to be virtuous in the public realm, while women were being taught to be virtuous within the household. And so since wisdom, as we initially said it, was intended to be more than just an intellectual pursuit, it was a way of being behaviorally. This set of teachings, this type of wisdom was trying to teach men and women how to maintain honor in both the public realm and in the private realm. And so you're having honorific roles being taught to young men and young women that adhered to the gender roles of the ancient Near Eastern culture. The assigned gender role for a young man was to be in the public realm. And so his virtue was determined by his righteousness. In other words, his choices that were made wisely regarding his own power that then had an effect on others publicly. Whereas a young woman was given less power, but also had the same kinds of choices to make about which way she was going to go. It just didn't extend past the home. It was really confined to the home, and that was it for her. But I think it's important to contextualize how men are not just getting off the hook like you might be able to infer from some of the honor shame system that was discussed in 4-6. Men are clearly being imbued with their own sense of responsibility, and that's inescapably present throughout the book. We've been hinting at this theme of faithfulness over and over. Is it, is the adultery religious or is it marital? I think there's no question that the text directly states that the issue is with marital fidelity, and so it's against marital infidelity. But because this is a religious text, and because it is an amalgamation of wisdom sayings of the ancient Near East and borrows from some other cultures, and the history of Israel was constantly under threat of invasion, there is a secondary way of reading the text, that religious fidelity is important, but it's also a part of righteousness. So if you're going to teach wisdom and you're going to teach young men how to uphold virtue in the public realm and to do so with good concern for others, you're also going to teach that interreligious marriages are not helpful. So that is, it's another way of reading this adultery text. It's less about cheating on God and it's more about intermarrying. It's more about not intermarrying certain religions, keeping good marriages between Hebrews. So, it's just sort of the old adage of, marrying someone in your own religion. And you can't overlook the fact that that would be a message given by the authors of a biblical text because, of course they're going to endorse Yahweh, Adonai, and say, hey, beware of Baal worshipers, and especially don't take one as a wife. And so, they're trying to warn against the allures of other religion. Those may be as strong as the temptations of an adulteress. And I think that also needs to be put in some context, not just in ancient Israelite context, but in a modern context. There are all kinds of temptations that we face and young men face to walk away from the religion of their youth, to either become atheistic or to not go to church, just be spiritual, things of that nature. And this is really combating that kind of thinking and saying it's really important to maintain religious fidelity, which you were taught by your parents is going to, for the good of the public, and for your own good as well, it will behoove you to pick that up and to marry within it. So it's some conservative thinking in today's time, but it is certainly appropriately conservative to the Hebrew context. Lastly, body language. There's so much talk about the body itself in all of these chapters, and it's one of the most direct pieces of Hebrew scripture where we receive such commentary on the human body. It's not normally so focused. Again, we talked earlier about how embodiment was a fuller concept that did not divide flesh from spirit as was done in Hellenistic cultures like those of the New Testament. And that the Hebrews' perspective on the body helped to teach the entire person because it accounted for the temptations of flesh and spirit. But I also think it's incredibly important to contextualize why that body language is used by the authors. I would argue that it gives yet another rationale for why women were employed as literary devices. One could argue till they're blue in the face that the representation of female characters in this text objectifies women, but the authorial intent to personify wisdom and folly as feminine figures that have female bodies adds this certain level of carnal ability to each of the characters to lure young men to them. And I think that helped to make the message more impactful. It wasn't just a stale message that young men might let go in one ear and out the other. It was housed in something that would always get their attention. And so I think that helps to lessen the blow of any objectification of women in the book that we can read into it. Because it's also possible that those characterizations or mischaracterizations, as it were intentionally figurative, and that any reader would have understood that. Now, you certainly can't test the limits of that because we don't know how it was read by Hebrews when received in ancient times, but it's important to put that in context. Finally, coming to a close with chapters 1 through 9. Next week, we will read chapters 10 through 22:16. I know that's kind of an odd demarcation, but that in itself is one unit. And then the following week, we will finish up the entire book. So I look forward to getting into the Wisdom Sayings of Solomon with you next week. Thank you for your time today and blessings in your Proverbs studies.